Okay, so in 15 minutes or less, we are going through elections. What I'm going to give you right now is just some basic vocabulary, some background knowledge, so when I see you next time, we can talk about voter trends and things that affect your decision to participate in the electoral process. So, electoral process is pretty much a state-run business. There's very little in the Constitution about how elections would work or what voter eligibility will be. And evidence of that has been the need throughout history to keep adding amendments that would allow more and more groups to vote and sort of democratize the Constitution. There are some federal regulations, though, that dictate how states will work. Federal elections, campaign finance is regulated by the Federal Elections Commission. Voting machines, the date in November for our elections, it's always an early Tuesday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of an even year. And then the Voting Rights Act also gives more guidelines to make sure that all people have access to voting. And so there's sort of three kinds of elections. You have primary elections, how within the party you picked your nominee. The general elections, that's the election that usually gets the most publicity for most people. And that's between the nominees from each of the major parties. And then elections on like specific policy. So I'm going to go through them in that order. Primaries and caucuses, this can get confusing with the other primary that I'm going to talk about today. So when we're talking later, and from your reading later about the presidential elections, to pick the nominees, there are primaries and caucuses throughout the states. So I'm going to table that, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledged it because I'm going to now talk about direct primaries for congressional races. So direct primary, that's the election to pick your party nominee for congressional and state offices. An open primary in a state, same thing, but we're talking now more specific detail about the primary. In an open primary, you can pick your nominee, you can go vote on them on election day, but you can decide that day which one you're going to participate in. So you can't vote in both the Democratic and Republican primaries, but you can show up that day and decide, I want to participate in this one or that one. Then you have the closed primary. That means beforehand you had to have registered with the party. So then on election day you show, yes, I've already registered with the party, and then you participate in that primary. And this is going to encourage party loyalty. Whereas with an open primary, you run the risk of maybe someone wanting to participate in a primary that's not their particular party, and maybe vote for the weaker candidate, hoping if they can get the weaker candidate from the opposing party to win, then they would face an easier general election. A note, blanket primaries have disappeared. They were said to be unconstitutional, but under a blanket primary, when you go vote, you would see essentially both ballots, and you could vote on both. The voters liked that. The folks who didn't like that were the parties. See, there's no mention of the political parties in the Constitution, so primaries are really an election that's sort of privately run, and so that was the Supreme Court's justification for striking down blanket primaries, that we have the right to assemble. So the party has the right to assemble and not, let anyone come in and participate if they're not a member of the party. Okay, so blanket primaries gone. Runoff primaries. These are the ones not all states have, done in 11 states. And the purpose of the runoff primary is to make sure that the candidate who wins the nomination from the party represents a majority. So if in the primary election there's no single person with a majority, maybe there were 4 or 5 candidates and they all got somewhere between 20 and 28%. Well, what you do is you pick the top 2 candidates, and 6 weeks later you have another election between those two. So voters who participated in the first one can come back 6 weeks later and then participate again, voting for one of the top 2 candidates. And this better ensures a majority winner. In the general elections, as I said, it's an early Tuesday, November, the first Tuesday after the first Monday of every even year, and then the terms for the winners start the next January. The presidential election is every 4 years, and it's on the same day for the election, and his term 2 starts in January, a little bit later though. And the ones The general elections for Congress that happen when there is no presidential race, so every other one, we call those midterm elections. And the midterm elections, we see a low in voter participation. People tend to get excited to come out and vote for the president, and then they'll vote in their congressional races. But at those midterms, we do see turnout decline. But I want to point out that the midterm elections are often sort of a reaction to either the economy or to how the president's doing. And this might explain, this is not on the notes here, but this might explain divided government. We're noticing a trend of when a president takes office, whatever his party is, that same party gains control of Congress. And 2 years after, in the next midterm election, if the people aren't happy with the presidency and the direction of things, we're noticing that, oh, Congress switches, and then we end up with a divided government. So this happened most recently in 2010. Obama, in 2008, elected the Democratic candidate elected to be president with a democratically controlled Congress, facilitating something like the Affordable Care Act getting passed. But then by 2010, as sort of a reaction to this, we see the Republicans take back control of the Congress. Okay, some interesting presidential elections. I've just picked 3 random ones that have something interesting about them. The Nixon-Kennedy election is a particularly interesting one in that we see how media had an interesting effect. The Nixon-Kennedy debate on television was the first time there was a televised debate, but lots of folks were still listening to it on the radio. Those who listened on the radio thought Nixon sounded so eloquent, so wonderful, they thought surely he won the debate. But those who watched it saw Nixon sweating, saw him he was shorter, he's in a gray suit, and they saw Kennedy, who was younger, looked healthier, tan, in a stronger, darker suit, and they thought he had won. So, kind of an interesting presidential debate. And Nixon was sick that day, and that's why he was sweating and suffering through flu-like symptoms. All right, the next one, Bush-Clinton. I picked this one in '92 because it brings up what we talked about in class, the spoiler effect. So you can see there on the left is the third candidate in that election, which was Ross Perot. And he garnered 19% of the vote, huge amount for a third-party candidate. But this was the spoiler effect here in play because the candidate more like him was Bush Sr. And so people who voted for him, they voted for him, but they sort of gave up their vote for Bush. And what happened was this had the effect of helping Clinton to win, who's probably much more different than either of those two candidates. So that's the spoiler effect evident in '92. And then finally, a fun one, 2000, the Bush-Gore election. So many interesting things about this one. But I wanted you to see the ballot here. So if you look at it with me, if you went to the polls, this was in, I can't remember, maybe Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the counties in Florida. And if you went to vote and you looked on the left, you saw, ooh, Bush, okay, don't want him. Gore, I want him. And you went over and cast your ballot. A lot of folks cast their one, the second one down, which now if you look over to the right, that would be an actual vote for Pat Buchanan. So a lot of folks had trouble with the ballot. And then the other issue is the hanging chad. You punch these through, and what if they didn't kind of punch through fully? So people really agonized over that. But this shows you how even the format of the ballot is a major deal to make sure it's clear to the voter and that your vote is counted. Moving on. All right, so we went through primaries. We went through general very quickly. Now I want to talk about when you, the voter, get to actually vote on legislation. Now, you will never get to vote really on national legislation, but in your state and in local politics, you can vote on propositions. And so there's kind of two groups when we think about that, the initiative petition and the referendum. The referendum is when your state legislature is looking at an issue, they don't know what to do, they're throwing their hands up in the air, and they decide, let's just take it to the voters. So they've already got the legislation put together, and then they look to the voters and say, cast your vote. Initiative petition is when the voters want to see something on the ballot. And that's going to take 10% of the votes, like signature. And when I say of the vote, in the last election, You take how many people had voted, 10% of that, we need to get that many signatures to get something on the ballot. Question to ponder, does a law have more legitimacy if it was passed by you through proposition or by your state legislature? Think about the pros and cons of either one. So we've talked about the 3 kinds of elections, but now it comes to you, the people, and voting. To vote, you have to be eligible, you have to register, you have to show up, you have to be informed enough to cast a vote, and then what else might depend on your state. In the state of Texas, you're going to need a photo ID. What's entailed in getting a photo ID? One thing in the 90s that happened that made voting a little bit easier was the Motor Voter Act, and this one was to require states to allow you to register to vote when you get your driver's license. You can do that in Texas. So when you go get your driver's license, you can register. You should pause the video here and copy these down. Make sure you are comfortable with these, and just these are the factors that go into whether or not you're going to get off the couch and go vote. And we're going to talk a lot about trends, so I want you to be comfortable with these ideas. So pause that if you need to. And coming up next class, we are going to look at voter trends, political socialization, how you developed your, ideology, affiliations, beliefs, and then why people don't vote. All right. Oops. We're ending.